Hello, economics, and welcome to lesson 8 of our unit 2. So this is unit 2, lesson 8. So we are going to be discussing what happens when we have changes in supply and demand. So in our previous lecture, we were talking about how when we graph a supply curve and a demand curve together, we get what we call our equilibrium point, which tells us our equilibrium price and our equilibrium quantity. So now the question is, what happens when we have a shift in supply, a shift in demand, or a shift in both at about the same time? And we'll see what happens when those take place. So let's get started. The key idea for this lecture is that a change in supply or demand, as shown by a shift on the supply or demand curve, causes the equilibrium price and quantity to change in a predictable way. Our learning objectives for this lecture. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to explain how a change in supply affects the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. You should be able to explain how a change in demand affects the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. And you should be able to explain what is known and what is unknown about the effect of a simultaneous change in both supply and demand. So in our previous lecture, we saw that when a market is in equilibrium, there is no tendency for the price or quantity to change. But we also know from previous lectures when we discussed demand by itself and then when we discussed supply by itself, that the demand curve and the supply curve can shift. These shifts cause the equilibrium price and quantity in the market to change. For example, many teenagers like to wear the latest fashions. The popularity of particular types of clothing, whether soccer jerseys, leggings, or board shorts, changes from year to year. These changes and similar changes in taste affect the demand for trendy goods and services. When an article of clothing becomes fashionable, the demand curve for that article shifts to the right. The excess demand causes the price to rise, and suppliers respond by increasing the quantities supplied. Similarly, changes in technology and disruptions in transportation cause the supply curves for some goods to shift. In our previous lecture, we opened by talking about the eruption of an Icelandic volcano in 2010 and how it disrupted the supply of salmon into Asia. Thus, in the Asian market for salmon, the supply curve shifted to the left. The price rose, and buyers responded by decreasing the quantity demanded. Some of the most important questions you will encounter in economics involve predicting how a shift of the supply curve or demand curve will affect a market. In this lecture, we will consider what happens to price and quantity when the supply curve shifts, when the demand curve shifts, and when both curves shift at the same time. Our first step in exploring these changes is to recall the different types of events that can change supply or demand and thus shift the supply or demand curve. And here we have a table that summarizes those causes of shifts that we learned previously. So remember, for demand, taste, that is like fashions, right? The taste of the consumers can shift the demand curve. The income of consumers can shift the demand curve. The price of related goods, such as complements or substitutes, can shift demand. The number of buyers in the market can shift demand, and expectations about the future can shift demand. And then for supply, we talked about how the cost of inputs can shift demand, how government policies such as taxes and subsidies and regulations can shift supply, and I should have said shift supply previously. The cost of inputs shifts supply. The number of firms producing the particular good or service can shift supply. Technology can shift supply. Natural disasters and weather can shift supply, and expectations about future prices can also shift supply. So, let's get into this. We're going to start with demand. When demand changes, the price consumers pay and the quantity purchased change as well. Now we will examine reasons for these potentially important changes in equilibrium price and quantity. Let's consider the market for spinach. Some people really like to eat spinach, but it takes a backseat to potatoes, lettuce, tomatoes, carrots, and even celery in terms of popularity. Suppose new research reveals unexpected health benefits from eating spinach. News of these benefits would increase people's preference for spinach. What would happen to the price and quantity of spinach? To answer this question, let's first consider the equilibrium in the spinach market before the new research is announced. In our graph, we can see the market supply and demand curves for spinach. The initial equilibrium, indicated by point E, subscript 1, here, is determined by the intersection of the original demand curve. Our original demand curve here, this blue one, notice in our legend it is called demand 1, and our supply, which is this red line, and I'm using red, but it's this red line here, which is indicated here in our legend as supply. Or really that should be supply 1, but since we're not going to draw a second supply curve, I've just ended up labeling it supply. You may have noticed something different about this graph. I have not placed any numbers here along the y-axis for price, nor have I placed any along the x-axis here for quantity. I have indicated that this is still quantity of spinach in bushels, and this is still price up here on our y-axis, but I haven't actually labeled them. Instead, I've labeled them P1 and P2 for our first price at our initial price at equilibrium point 1 here, and our second price, our new price, when in this case our demand curve shifts, P2. Same for quantity, Q1 shifting to Q2. Q1 is corresponding to our equilibrium point, our initial equilibrium point, E1, and Q2 with our secondary or our new equilibrium point, E2. It is useful to draw a demand supply curve like this, and we call this a generic. This is called a generic, right, supply and demand graph. And these are relatively easy to just draw on a blank piece of paper. We don't need lots of grid lines. We can do it pretty quickly. In fact, I will redraw this, right, without the aid of my graph lines. We don't even need to do that. So this is quantity, this is price, right? And I can use some colors here, so we're just going to recreate this. Our dark blue, so here's our initial demand, so I'm going to label that demand 1. Remember we went over this in class earlier when we were still meeting in class. And here's my initial supply, so supply 1. And then we can then indicate, I'm just going to use green, this is our initial equilibrium point, so E1. Right, and then I can draw a dotted line just down here to our, oops, my pen didn't work there, down to my quantity axis, and this was going to be quantity 1, and one over here to our price axis, and that's going to be price 1. Okay. And then again, I can then draw, in this case, a secondary. And our graph already tells us, right, that our next demand, our demand shifts to the right. So I can just draw a new demand here, demand 2. And again, identify my equilibrium as E2, dash line down to quantity 2, over here to my y-axis for price 2. This here then is a generic supply and demand graph, but it is very useful to kind of plot out what's going to happen to price and quantity when we have movements of either supply or demand. So the next couple graphs are going to be these computer generated ones like I've shown here, and then I'm going to go ahead and draw some of these. I'm going to want you to pay attention to drawing these generic supply and demand graphs, because I'm going to be asking you to draw some of these in your homework. So pay attention to how we do it. It's not that difficult, just kind of pay attention to what's going on. But our first couple ones we're going to look at is going to go ahead and look more like this, just to be familiar and so that we can see exactly what's taking place. So let's consider the effect of the new research finding on the spinach. Back over here to our initial graph, and I'm going to go ahead and erase some of this stuff here so we can look and see what's going on. Okay, so knowing that spinach is especially healthy, at any given price, consumers will demand more spinach than before. This change in taste causes an increase in demand, represented by a rightward shift of the demand curve from demand 1 to demand 2. And that is what this arrow is indicating, right? Our demand curve 1, this darker blue one, is shifting this way to our new one, which is this lighter blue one indicated down here, right? And so at any price point, like at price 1, the quantity demanded for spinach has increased. When the demand curve shifts to the right, the price will not stay at P1 when we have a supply curve, right? When we have supply curve drawn, because notice our equilibrium price is going to change. After the shift, the quantity of spinach demanded at the old price of P1 is greater than the quantity supplied. So at our new point here, oops, sorry, I need to erase. There we go. Right? So on our new demand curve, demand 2, notice that at price 1, right, at price 1, supply is still here, but now quantity demanded is here. And remember, we call that an excess of demand, or excess demand. And so as we talked about in our last lecture, demand is going to force the price up. Excess demand is going to force the price up. On this side, suppliers are going to respond by increasing the supply because price is going up, and eventually they're going to meet at our new equilibrium point, which is going to be E2 here, and we're going to have a new price and a new quantity demanded and supplied. Here, they are both equal. Because now supply and demand are now back in balance, there will be no more tendency for the price to rise or fall. So once it reaches that point, we are in balance again, as we talked about in our last lecture. And now, unless a major change occurs, that's going to be the new price and quantity for spinach. Let's note what happened to the price and quantity. Again, the price increased because of this. We can see that here, and our quantity increased as well. So this lets us know that if the market supply remains unchanged, anything that causes the demand curve to shift to the right will cause the price and quantity to increase. So what happens when we have a decrease in demand? An alternative story. Suppose that instead of finding new health benefits, research indicates that eating too much spinach turns your skin green, let's say, right? Once consumers become aware of this, their interest in spinach will wilt, and they will demand less spinach at each price, as illustrated by a leftward shift of the demand curve. Again, we now have demand 1 is our darker blue here, and it's going to shift now to our lighter blue line. That is the change in demand. So we have our initial equilibrium point, and it looks like I forgot to write in our second equilibrium point. So that's here, E2. Put a little box around that. Okay. And again, as we learned in our previous lecture, this is determined by finding that point where supply and demand cross, where that intersection is, and that is our equilibrium point, where price, right, where the price is agreeable for both demand, the consumer and the seller, at a particular quantity. Now in this case, when demand shifts to the left or decreases, notice what happens. We have again a new equilibrium point here. We have a new quantity now. Notice that it is less than our original quantity, and we have a new price. Again, less than our starting price. So the price has fallen, quantity has fallen, because again, suppliers now, right, they have excess. So if we look at this at our original price, right, which is greater at our original price. At our original price up here along this green line, supply, red, our red line here, is greater than demand at that price point. So here we have excess supply. And when we have excess supplies, we talked about in lecture yesterday, right? Forces are going to drive the supplier of the good to reduce how much they supply. And that also means that they're not willing to supply at higher prices, price is going to drop. Remember the law of supply, right? So price will drop, suppliers are going to offer less because in this case they have excess. They can't sell that difference, that excess supply, because there aren't people willing to buy it. And as the price drops, well, more people become willing to buy that product. And so from here, so demand will increase from this point a little bit until we reach where they intersect again. But notice, again here, it is a decrease in quantity, in total quantity, right? So from this point, quantity demanded increased on our new, right, is higher at this price point. But the important part is that here we have a new quantity supplied and quantity demanded, and they equal each other at this new point, E2, which is quantity 2. So what we learn from this is if the market supply remains unchanged, anything that causes the demand curve to shift to the left will cause the price and quantity to fall. So now let's look at supply. Like changes in demand, changes in supply influence the equilibrium price and quantity in important ways. A decrease in supply. Consider what happens when supply decreases, as represented by a leftward shift in the supply curve. We'll use the example of a ruptured gasoline pipeline that occurred in Phoenix, Arizona several years ago. As a result of this disaster, the quantity of gasoline available for sale in Phoenix decreased at every price. Now we can consider how this event affected the equilibrium price and quantity of gasoline in Phoenix. Our graph here provides hypothetical supply and demand curves for the gasoline market in Phoenix. In the month before the pipeline broke, the market for gasoline in Phoenix was in equilibrium at E1, as we can see in our graph, where the original supply curve, supply 1, and the original demand curve, I've just labeled it demand, but it should be demand 1, intersect. The equilibrium price was $2.50 per gallon, and the equilibrium quantity was 4 million gallons. Now, in this case, I have indicated those quantities because we know of those particular quantities. But the other quantities we're not sure of. We're not sure exactly the slope or the elasticity of this. So we haven't included all of them. We've just marked out the ones that were given to us. Remember, in the spinach one, right, our problem, as I've given it to you, didn't have an actual price per bushel of spinach. We just said it increased or decreased. Here, our problem has given us the price, so we can write that price in. But again, we don't need to label all of them because we don't know the exact slope of our curve, so we're not going to do that. After the pipeline broke, firms were willing to supply less gasoline at each price. This shifted the supply curve for gasoline leftward to supply 2. At the original price of $2.50 per gallon, the quantity demanded exceeded the quantity supplied. The resulting excess demand pushed the price up to the level at which the new supply curve, supply 2, crossed the original demand curve, demand 1. At the new equilibrium point, E2, the price was $3 per gallon, and the equilibrium quantity was 3 million gallons. As you would expect, drivers in Phoenix were not very happy about the 50-cent price increase. Their wallets felt the effects of the gasoline pipeline rupture. A supply curve can also shift in a rightward direction, indicating an increase in supply. Consumers like this much better. Our table here provides a simplified version of what happened in the Florida strawberry market between 2010 and 2011. In the spring of 2010, the market for Florida strawberries was in equilibrium at point E1, where the original supply curve, E1, and the original demand curve, the original supply curve, supply 1, and the original demand curve, demand 1, or in this case just demand because there was not a second demand curve, intersect. Price of a pound of strawberries was $3.50, and the quantity sold was 205 million pounds. Again, I've indicated those exact quantities here. In the spring of 2011, strawberry producers found that their fields were producing far more strawberries than in 2010 because of an unusual combination of sunshine and rain. An abundance of fruit made producers willing to supply more strawberries at each price. Supply increased, and the supply curve shifted rightward from supply 1 to supply 2. This shift caused an excess supply at the initial price. As a result, the price fell, and the market moved to a new equilibrium at point E2, the intersection of the new supply curve, supply 2, and the original demand curve, supply 1. At the new equilibrium, the price was $2.50 per pound, a $1 decrease from the initial price per pound. The equilibrium quantity rose from 205 million pounds to 246 million pounds. Buyers were delighted with the lower price at the new equilibrium. They were left with more money in their wallets to buy additional goods, including more strawberries. So, did you get it? Why does an increase in the supply of a good result in a change in the equilibrium price and the quantity of that good? See if you can answer that question. Again, you don't need to do this in this canvas on discussion. This is just you. Take a moment, think about that question, see if you can answer it. Try and write out an answer. And if you're not sure, then maybe this is a question you need some follow-up with when we have our Q&A video conference. All right, so let's continue. Sometimes simultaneous changes in supply and demand cause both the supply curve and the demand curve to shift at the same time. For example, the supply curve for gasoline could shift because of a pipeline accident, and, by coincidence, at the same time, the demand curve for gasoline could shift because of the introduction of a popular new electric car. In this example, both the supply curve and the demand curve would shift to the left. In other cases, the curves both shift to the right, or they shift in opposite directions. In this part of our lecture, we are going to consider how shifts of both the demand curve and the supply curve affect the market. Our first example is going to look at when supply and demand decrease by the same amount and what happens. So here I do have a grid here just to help draw some straight lines, but this is what we're going to be asking you to do here. So let's take a look at this. So what happens when supply and demand decrease by the same amount? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and draw a initial demand curve. And I'm going to use blue. I'm going to try and be consistent and always use blue for demand. And you can see that's a mostly straight line there. And supply is going to be red, mostly straight line. So this is supply, this is supply 1. This is demand 1. This is, of course, our equilibrium 1, that point here. And that means that we have, right, we come down here, we have quantity 1, because this is quantity of our item, whatever it happens to be, and this is price. Okay. And then we now have our initial price, or P1 here. So our problem, our hypothetical here, we didn't even know what the product is, but our hypothetical is what happens when demand and supply both decrease by the same amount. So let's start with demand. A decrease in demand is going to be a shift to the left. So I'm going to draw a new blue line. Right, and these grids help me demonstrate that this is a shift of basically one grid line. Okay, so I can show that we are going to have similar shifts in supply as well. So this is my new demand. So this is now demand 2, right? And now I'm going to draw a new supply. Again, shift to the left, so I'm going to draw a new supply to the left of my original supply. And this is supply 2. Now here's the tricky part. To find our new equilibrium point, we have to look for where D2 crosses S2 when we have movement of both supply and demand. So if we were to choose this point here, that would be wrong, because that is where D1 is intersecting supply 2, and we're looking for the new price when supply and demand have both changed. So we're not going to use that point, nor are we going to use this point, because this is the intersection of supply 1 and demand 2. We are looking for the intersection of demand 2 and supply 2, and that's going to be here. So this is our new equilibrium point. So we call that equilibrium 2. This is going to be our new quantity, Q2. And notice what happens. When supply and demand decrease by the same amount, we do not have a change in price. The price remains the same. Okay? So let's try what happens when supply decreases less than demand. So again, we're going to draw some initial demand and supply curves. So let's go ahead and do that. So here's our beginning demand. Okay. Demand 1. And here's our beginning supply. We're going to draw it here. Supply 1. Again, E1, quantity 1, and price 1. Don't want to forget to label our axes with a quick P for price and Q for quantity. All right, so Our problem is saying what happens when supply decreases less than demand decreases. So we're going to have a decrease in demand, right? It's just the decrease in demand is going to be greater than the decrease in supply, or the opposite, supply decreases less than demand. So let's draw a demand change first. And I'm going to use a slightly different blue color just to help us identify that this is demand 2. This is going to be a significant change. So we're going to draw this new demand. Let's say we draw this new demand here. Okay, so this is our new demand, demand 2. I'm just going to extend my supply curve a little bit more here for this one. There we go. Okay, and now our new supply, I'm going to use orange for our new supply just to help us differentiate between new supply. So again, supply is decreasing, but it's decreasing less than demand decreases. Okay, so this was a decrease of about 2 grid lines, so demand was. So now let's do supply with a decrease of simply 1 grid line. Supply 2. Okay, so we have supply shifting to the left. We have demand shifting to the left. Okay. But supply was less than demand as far as the shifting to the left. So what is our new equilibrium point, and therefore what is our new price and new quantity? So again, we have to look for where now demand 2 crosses supply 2. Again, that is not going to be where demand 1 and supply 2 cross. I'm going to use purple for that. So not there, right? If you're thinking it's there, that's not correct, because that is where supply 2 and demand 1 cross. Nor is it going to be down here where supply 1 and demand 2 cross. Neither of those are our new equilibrium point. Our new equilibrium point is where supply 2 and demand 2 intersect, which is here. So that is our new equilibrium point, E2. This means that this is our new quantity, quantity 2, and our new price. So when the demand curve shifts farther to the left than the supply curve, the price will fall. That's what we learned from this, right? We know if we're looking for what happens to price, we know that the price will fall when the change in demand is, the decrease in demand is greater than the decrease in supply. So what happens when supply decreases more than demand? Okay, so again, we're going to set this up. Again, this is how we go about this, and again, I'll be asking you to do this here pretty soon on your own. Set this up with price and quantity. Draw a initial demand curve. So let's draw this initial demand curve here. Oops. There we go. Try to keep it a straight line there. Not very good. Demand 1. And our initial supply curve. Now notice I ended up with a point right that's in the middle of one of my boxes. That's fine. That's not a problem. This is supply 1. We're going to identify our initial, our starting equilibrium point, E1. Some dashed lines indicating our quantity, and then some dashed lines over here to our y-axis, our price axis, and this gives us price 1. All right, So again, the problem is supply decreases more than demand. So let's have a significant change in supply first, just because that's what the problem, that's where we're going to have more of. So let's have a pretty significant one. Let's draw that change in supply over here. Supply 2, right? And that's a leftward movement of supply. Now let's go ahead and draw. Oh, I drew it in red again. So just make sure that we're looking at supply 1 and 2. Right, I didn't change colors, so I'm going to use the same color for demand. Right, we have demand. We have a shift to the left of demand, but it is not as great as supply this time. So let's just do a small one here. Something like that. This is, oops, I just erased it. Let's try that again. This is demand 2. All right, so what happens? Well, again, we're looking for where supply 2 and demand 2 intersect. We don't want to confuse ourselves and look at where demand 2 and supply 1 intersect, or where demand 1 and supply 2 intersect. We're looking for where demand 2 and supply 2 intersect, because both of these are moving. We're saying that demand is changing, shifting, supply is shifting, and we want to know where our new equilibrium point is going to be. So we look for where demand 2 and supply 2 intersect, and that's going to be right here. So this is now our new E2. Go ahead and indicate where our new quantity is, quantity 2, and our new price, P2. Now, notice in this case, right, we also had a decrease in demand. But notice in this case, what happened to price? Well, in this case, price increased. Our quantity decreased. But in this case, our price increased because the change in supply was greater than the change in demand. The decrease in supply was greater than the decrease in demand. All right. So that pause was just in case you had any questions. Let's go on and to our last one. So what happens when supply increases and demand decreases? Well, let's draw it out and find out. Let's draw out a hypothetical and see what happens. So let's draw a demand. Sorry. Let's draw a demand here. And let's draw some supply. Okay, let's make sure we label everything before we go too far. So that's supply, oops, my mistake. That should be supply 1. This should be demand 1. This should be quantity. This should be price. Okay, here's our equilibrium point, E1. Little dashed lines, quantity 1, our starting quantity, price 1. Okay, so this is asking us supply increases, so let's do that. So supply increases, that's going to be a shift to the right. So let's draw a new supply curve here. Supply 2. And demand decreases. So let's draw a new demand curve like this. Oops. Using the stylus, and it's fun and it helps helpful, but also a little tricky sometimes. And I hit the erase button. Okay. So demand decreased. And I see that I erased our initial, look at that, our initial supply curve. So let's draw that again. There we go. So we have an increase in supply, we have a decrease in demand. Now I did choose intentionally to draw these changes equal to each other. Okay. We could, right, we could have some unknowns depending on how much one changes. But when one increases and one decreases, we usually have a situation like this. Usually our quantity is going to remain the same. So let's look for our new equilibrium point. And that's going to be, again, where D2 and S2 cross, which happens to be here. And wow, I keep hitting that erase button. There we go. That happens to be here, E2. So our quantity is not going to change, right? We remain at Q1. But notice at this point, I also happen to erase our supply. I'm having a real hard time with this today. Okay, notice that our new price is going to be here. And that is going to be a significant drop. Well, not significant, it's just going to be a drop. So when we have a supply increase and a demand decrease, we know for sure that the price will fall. We don't know by how much. We're not sure what's going to happen to quantity. We just know the price will fall. It has to fall. And I'm using this equal one, right? This equal change to show that even if quantity doesn't change, price will fall. Quantity could increase, perhaps, depending on how much, right, supply or demand changed. But when they are moving in opposite directions, the price will always fall. All right. So I hope you followed that. We'll see when we have our video conference how well we followed that. So let's wrap up. If the supply curve and the demand curve both shift to the left, how can you tell what happens to the equilibrium price? And we just discussed that. So take a moment to go back and answer that question. All right, so let's wrap up. In summary, our table here summarizes how various changes in supply and demand affect the equilibrium price and quantity of a good. For example, if supply decreases and demand is unchanged, then the equilibrium price must increase and the equilibrium quantity must decrease. Remember that for both supply and demand, a rightward shift represents an increase and a leftward shift represents a decrease. So just to read our table here, which you will want to refer to, we have what the shift is taking place for supply. Right, so here we have shifts in supply, shifts in demand, right? And our options are unchanged, decrease, or increase. And this is what happens, right? So if we have a decrease in supply, no change in demand, then our price will go up and our quantity will go down. And that's how we're going to read that. Note here where the question marks are, such here for 5, if we have a decrease in supply and an increase in demand, we know that price will increase. What we don't know is what's going to happen to quantity. And that's because we need actual numbers to know exactly what's going to happen there. It could remain the same or it could shift. And that's what that question mark means. All right, that is the end of our lecture. You'll have a concept check to see how we do. And of course, we'll have a video tomorrow to go over any questions you have. Have a great day.